Okay, good morning, everybody. Happy to have all you here join us again for our webinar this morning. As I'm sure you're all aware, there's a lot going on out there in the world, so let's jump into things. My name is Jason Flynn, and I am the Director of Human Resources and Client Services for Prestige PEO. Joining us today is the founder and principal of Prestige PEO, Andrew Lubash. And Andrew comes with a lot of experience and expertise in all things PEO related, as well as regulatory, as he is very involved with the industry also. Of course, we also welcome back Seth Peretta and Ryan Temmey, both who are partners over at the Groom Law Group. The Groom Law Group has been our trusted partner throughout many of these webinars, and it's great to be able to bring their expertise to everybody attending the webinar this morning. Again, great to have everybody on the webinar participating this morning, and I'm looking forward to what they're able to bring out to all the attendees today. As we look at the agenda for today's webinar, Andrew will be kicking things off with an introduction. From that point on, Seth and Ryan will be providing an update. They'll be providing an update on the whirlwind COVID negotiations and stimulus discussions. At that point, they'll be giving an update on the ACA Supreme Court review before getting into the upcoming presidential election and congressional races. Finally, we'll wrap up with a discussion around the candidates' health and tax positions and what that means for the upcoming election. Just as a quick reminder, all participants will be muted throughout the webinar. However, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A feature within the webinar itself and direct those questions to the panelists. We'll do our best to answer all the incoming questions as we do each week. A copy of the presentation is currently on our website, and as well as a copy of the recording will follow. Now, at this point, what I'd like to do is hand the reins over to Andrew Lubash to say a few words. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. No, not a problem. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time out again to attend our series of Wednesday webinars. Again, the topic, it's funny, when we scheduled this topic, we thought things were going to be a little different when we got to today. And yesterday changed a lot of different things. But then again, overnight, it's changing back. So, again, trying to keep on top of what's really happening here and stay informed, and not even just, I guess, regarding, obviously, like PPP and things like that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, but what really is happening in Washington, what is happening in the election, what different platforms mean, what different who wins may have a bearing on, a lot of different things. And this way, again, what this can do is help us all, make sure that we're guiding our companies ourselves in the right direction and that we're prepared. So nothing really becomes a surprise that if, something is passed or not passed or elected or not elected, that we can make educated decisions regarding our benefits. As I've mentioned before, Seth Peretta and I have worked closely together for at least 10 plus years around NAPIO. He was a big help for me when I was NAPIO chairman. And again, so, I've had a lot of interaction with him, and Seth is plugged in and knows it as well, knows this stuff inside out. Ryan also. I haven't been as interactive with Ryan as I have with Seth over the years, but again, Ryan comes with a wealth of information, a background where he is also incredibly plugged into what's happening in D.C. So again, maybe this will give us all an insight of what could possibly be to come and how we can navigate these waters, because I think we all agree, regardless of where we stand, we've never seen anything quite like this. So again, I'd like to turn it over to Seth because you guys want to hear him talk, not me. And again, I hope everybody is well and safe, and that somewhere soon life goes back to normal. All righty, Seth, it's all yours. I'm going to be muted now.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have my colleague Ryan Temmey join me. Ryan spent 7 years up on Capitol Hill before joining us at Groom Law Group, and is very familiar with the ways of both the executive branch, but also specifically the legislative branch, and is a member of our firm's policy practice, and very pleased to have him here because, as you'll see, notwithstanding my familiarity and location in Washington, D.C., Ryan really knows this stuff. So we're We're lucky to have him on today's call. The agenda here has already been walked through. We're going to run through, I think, some pretty significant things, not only for you as taxpayers and U.S. citizens, but also in connection specifically with small business and issues around tax and healthcare and other sorts of things. So moving on now to our next slide here, we're going to do an update on COVID 4.0 negotiations. And as I think Andy alluded to, it is an incredibly dynamic and fluid situation. If we turn to the next slide here, where we are in terms of the state of play, this slide is already out of date because yesterday there were some pretty significant developments involving the president and the negotiations that continue on. But Ryan, do you want to give us a sense of sort of where we are in terms of the negotiations and the developments from yesterday and then again from last night?
Sure thing, and thanks for having me. So basically we had been in a holding pattern for a pretty lengthy period of time until about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, where COVID 4.0 seemed pretty unlikely to pass in light of some less than optimistic economic news. Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin began negotiating in earnest again. About 2 weeks ago. Those negotiations have continued, and there had been some headway made up until last weekend or last Friday. The president's COVID diagnosis seemed to change the dynamic somewhat. I think Speaker Pelosi viewed it as an opportunity to push harder. The president, I think, was sort of out of the loop a little bit over the weekend, and those talks kind of stalled again, and the House went ahead and passed its version of a COVID relief package, which dialed in at about $2.2 trillion. Secretary Mnuchin and the Speaker continued to talk until yesterday, when the president announced that he didn't think a relief package should be passed until after the election. Which obviously puts in, significantly dampened any optimism that something would pass, prior to the beginning of November. As Andy alluded overnight, that the president seems to have walked that back, saying that relief should pass, some relief should pass before the election. So where we are is, I think we're definitely facing a moving target. The big obstacle is, I think, the total dollar number, and how the different levers in the bill can be tweaked to get to a number that both sides can agree to. I think from a political perspective, the House Democrats, while they have a healthy majority, do have more moderate members in moderate districts that where they are itching to have something to talk about on COVID relief, since Congress really hasn't done anything on COVID since April. So what we do think there are political pressures on the House side. Those pressures don't seem as acute on the Senate side, where vulnerable Senate Republicans have not been pushing as hard to get something done. So I think that has created an odd dynamic where the chamber with the higher likelihood of changing control is less motivated to take any kind of action. So I think what we really are focusing on is whether or not the parties can drive down the total cost, and the big ticket items are economic stimulus, so an additional round of stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment insurance, and then some of the additional relief under the PPP loan program.
So thank you, Ryan. It sounds like, President Trump, I don't know if folks are following this, but he tweeted out, basically, I'm calling Mnuchin back. We're done negotiating until after the election. effectively saying, like, if you want something to happen, because remember, there's basically 3 months after the end of the election until the change in the presidency. So even if Biden were to win, there's a very long stretch of time. I think some saw it as potentially sort of trying to say either reelect me and we'll get relief done, or don't reelect me and you risk getting nothing until, February. The markets did not respond well to that strategy. There was about a 600-point swing, which I suspect is what drove Trump to then sort of say, just kidding, I will support some form of stimulus. If we move to the next slide here, Ryan already touched on this, but as we talked about on a couple other webinars, the House passed HEROES Act, which had a price tag of around $3 trillion. It did provide for a round of stimulus, unemployment insurance, and on paycheck protection. The HEROES Act goes way back to basically, I want to say maybe May. I can't remember the exact date, but there weren't even second draw loans in this because this was passed so early on. They hadn't even contemplated the idea that there would be a need for second draw PPP loans. That rather came out in the Republican HEALS Act. But these are many of the provisions that are currently under discussion and negotiation between the Senate Republicans and really the House Democrats. On the next slide as well, there are some other provisions in the HEROES Act that are also part of that conversation, including specifically the employer immunity shield. As Ryan had mentioned, the House Democrats in some ways are sort of bargaining against themselves, which is they seem motivated to try to do something. And so they've continued to sort of ratchet down the potential cost of COVID 4.0, starting at $3 trillion and now down to 2.2. The Senate Republicans, though, and the administration do seem focused on sort of a bipartisan piece of legislation as a negotiating point. And that's reflected on the next slide here, which is the House Problem Solvers Caucus proposal. And this appears to be more closely aligned with where things may be heading. Ryan, can you just give a little bit of update as to sort of what this proposal would provide for?
Yeah, this is effectively a skinnier version of the House passed bill. It does include a liability shield, which is clearly important for Senate Republicans and the administration. And really what it does is it gets to a lower number by sort of changing the dials on the amounts of the big ticket items. So when we talk about the stimulus payments, unemployment insurance is a little bit lower than in the House passed bill, and then additional PPP funding. What I think is important is that this is a bipartisan approach. I think there's a sense that again, this is a group of House Democrats that are typically going to be viewed as more moderate, and as a result more vulnerable in November. So I think there's this is the target that that really kind of identifies that political pressure for the House to get something done. On the Senate side, I think there's a decent amount of appetite for something like this, or at a minimum, there's not a huge amount of opposition. The price tag is a little bit higher than Senator McConnell has sort of maintained throughout, which is he wanted the next economic stimulus to be around, or COVID bill to be around $1 trillion. The price tag here is $1.5 trillion, and but it's sort of odd to say that a $500 billion difference is getting close, but it at this point, I think with the amount of money that we've already spent on COVID response, it is a bridgeable divide.
And just for folks, you'll see there, as Ryan mentioned, liability shield, which is something the Democrats had been very much opposed to, but I think they've realized it's non-negotiable from the Republican perspective. On PPP loans, it does a couple things, right? There was money remaining that had been appropriated but not used on the first draw of PPP loans, about $145 billion. That would effectively be reappropriated for a second round of loans. And there would be some additional new money for PPP second draw loans. The other thing that would be in here would be basically enhanced rules around simplified forgiveness. So rules that would effectively allow small PPP loans to be automatically forgiven, also reducing the extent of audit, et cetera. So lots of, I think, good news, even under the sort of skinny down bipartisan bill, for small business who are interested in a second round on PPP loans. Ryan, I guess, given what's transpired, given that we're less than a month away from the presidential election, given that voting has already started in many states, what do you put as the likelihood that we see Congress pass a compromise bill and the Senate and the president signs it into law prior to November 3rd?
So I think a lot of this is obviously going to be politically driven. The one thing to note is that the dynamics in some of the Senate races have changed a little bit in the last week or so. So you have maybe a higher likelihood than we did a week ago of the Republicans maintaining control of the Senate, to the extent that, and in particular in North Carolina, that race has changed a little bit due to some revelations about the challenger. So what I think we can expect is, it's tough to put a percentage on it, but I think it's, we have probably a higher likelihood than we did even a couple of weeks ago of something passing, because the Senate might have a little more motivation than they had shown earlier. The only caveat to that is that, because of some COVID infections among senators, the Senate has adjourned until at least the 16th. So really, I think it will require that Secretary Mnuchin and Speaker Pelosi come to an agreement. That agreement passes in the House, and then the Senate will take it up. So from a procedural perspective, there could be some built-in delays, but I think those Senate races becoming slightly more favorable and the potential to maintain control of the Senate by Republicans increasing does improve the outlook somewhat.
Thank you very much. So, like any good lawyer, there is an increased likelihood of passage. That is a technical way to avoid answering the question, but I appreciate it very much. So maybe we now move on to the next topic on our agenda here, which was to talk about the ACA Supreme Court review. Before we talk about sort of what's happening with the Supreme Court, the implications of RBG's, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, this case here, the challenge by the House Republicans to the Affordable Care Act and by the administration to the Affordable Care Act is likely to have very significant implications for employers, for your employees, for overall health policy, for what Biden does in the first 100 days, or a Trump if he is reelected. The interesting thing here is that typically you would see the first 100 days being a very important day to move significant pieces of legislation. While this case will be heard by the Supreme Court soon after the election, or is scheduled to be, the decision is not likely to come out until June or July. So you can imagine a scenario where, as folks are preparing for fall open enrollment, getting ready to head into coverage decisions for next year, we have a potentially sort of ground-shaking, ground-breaking decision out of the Supreme Court. So, Ryan, before we talk about the passing of RBG and the potential nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, or ACB, can you just give a quick overview as to what the case is and what its potential implications may be?
Sure. So in the first round of litigation over the ACA, one of the primary issues was whether or not the individual mandate exceeded Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause. The Supreme Court held in NFI v. Sebelius that it did in fact exceed the Commerce Clause power, but Justice Roberts characterized it as a tax rather than a penalty, and as a result upheld it as a permissible exercise of Congress's taxing authority. In 2017, in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, Congress eliminated the penalty amount and just zeroed it out, but left the mandate in place. So what happened is Texas and 17 other Republican states, as well as a handful of individual plaintiffs, sued the administration and said, we no longer think that the individual mandate is a tax because it raises no revenue, and we want it to be held unconstitutional. And then in addition to that, there's no severability provision in the ACA that says if any of these provisions are held unconstitutional, the rest of the statute should survive. So because there's no severability provision, Texas and the other states argued that in addition to the individual mandate going away, we want the entire ACA, all 900 pages of legislative text and 50,000 pages of regulatory text, to be stricken down, and that slate wiped clean. The district court in Texas agreed with the state of Texas. It held that the individual mandate was unconstitutional, and it struck down the entire ACA. The Fifth Circuit on appeal said, we agree that that the mandate is unconstitutional without a tax, without any penalty, but we don't think that the judge in Texas did all the work he needed to do to figure out which parts of the ACA should survive and which parts shouldn't. So the court remanded back to the district court to do that work. All the parties appealed or sought a review by the Supreme Court, and that review was granted with oral argument scheduled for November 10th. So we're sort of at a point where the Supreme Court has three questions that it will be considering. The first and the threshold question is whether or not any of the parties actually have standing to bring the complaint and to challenge the law. The second being whether the mandate's unconstitutional, and the third being whether it's severable from the rest of the ACA. Now, there's also a whole lot of other parties involved here, because California, New York, and a bunch of the Democratic-led states intervened in the lawsuit as a result of the Trump administration changing course from the and deciding not to defend the ACA. The House of Representatives also joined the lawsuit, and so they are all parties to the litigation.
Thank you, Ryan. Obviously, folks, you've seen, I think, in the debates and in public remarks by Biden in connection with President Trump, this argument that the administration, by challenging the ACA, has the potential to both eliminate important coverage protections during a pandemic, but also eliminate the prohibition on pre-existing condition exclusions. This is one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later, which is leaving aside whichever political side you fall on, the Trump administration really does not have at this point really an alternative to the ACA, and you can't just eliminate pre-existing condition exclusions without doing things to address, anti-risk selection and sort of potentially driving healthier lives into the insurance pools. Otherwise, things don't necessarily work in the long term. And so what we see is a lot of political wrangling over the potential implications of a Supreme Court review of the ACA. On the next slide here, we begin to get into really the very significant effects of RBG's passing. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a very sort of liberal justice. Her judicial ideology was to read the Constitution as a living, breathing document. Versus if you think about Justice Scalia, former Justice Scalia, or you think about some of the folks on the right side of this graphic here, who read the Constitution as a textualist or as an originalist. RBG's existence on the court was very important for the ACA's review, because if you put her on this graphic, she would be on the left-hand side, and you would see there would be 5 folks on the left-hand side. And then you also have John Roberts, who, as Ryan mentioned, did engage in some, I think, helpful judicial analysis if you're in support of the ACA. In the original case, I'm not sure when it was, back in 2015, perhaps. So folks were anticipating a potentially a 6-3 decision. But unfortunately, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, you now see that we have at most Sonia Sotomayor, Stephen Breyer, Elena Kagan, and John Roberts. So you've got 4 folks who we think would definitely be on the side of supporting the ACA. And then we've got 4 folks who, based on their prior votes, would be opposing the ACA, or the constitutionality of the ACA. And so the potential nomination of Amy Coney Barrett is hugely important for the fate of the ACA, because she has espoused that she has a judicial ideology that is based on textualism or originalism. And we would expect, based on that ideology and based on her past judicial opinions as a federal court judge, that she would be on the right side of this graphic, which means it would end up being potentially 5-4, even if John Roberts moves to the middle. And so the question then becomes not really if the ACA is struck down, it's really a question of how much of it gets struck down. Will they just strike down the individual mandate and suggest the rest of it is severable? Will the ACA market reforms be maintained, et cetera? One of the really interesting things, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, is that if the Senate, if the Democrats win the White House and take control of the Senate and maintain control of the House, right? Query to what extent they engage in federal legislation to reimpose some de minimis individual mandate penalty to breathe life back into the individual mandate as a way to potentially moot the Supreme Court's review of the ACA. There is so much potential here for intervening events. It's hard to really say what the fate of the ACA will be. If we move to the, Ryan?
All I was going to say is that, and I completely agree with Seth, but there's also the caveat that when you're looking at this chart, Justice Kavanaugh, who's generally viewed as very conservative, has also taken a much more, this is kind of one of those odd situations where that textualist approach and originalist approach also dovetails with limited judicial intervention. And so what we've seen in some cases that Justice Kavanaugh has written in the last year or so is that when he's doing that severability analysis and seeing which parts of the statute have to go away when one part is held unconstitutional, he takes a very narrow view of that. So you might have a decision, you could conceive of a decision where the individual mandate is determined to be unconstitutional on a fairly large majority, but then there's a much closer call on which of the other parts of the ACA go away, because Justice Kavanaugh might side on a more tempered approach that only strikes down the individual mandate and lets the rest of the statute survive.
So effectively, you have Sotomayor, Breyer, Kagan, Roberts, and Kavanaugh forming some straight fellows. Yep, in a 5-4 decision. Effectively, it's unconstitutional, but the ACA lives on.
Yep.
In the next slide, this is just to highlight that, as many of you may have been following the news, there's been the Democrats obviously very unhappy with the desire to try to seat Amy Coney Barrett on the court prior to basically the election, and also some belief that the incoming president and the incoming Congress should have a say over this seat on the Supreme Court rather than the current Congress and the current president. This graphic here just shows you generally how long it's taken to seat a Supreme Court justice over the course of going back, say, 20 years. One of the really interesting things about Amy Coney Barrett is that the Senate Republicans have a great interest in trying to get her confirmed as soon as possible, not just because they'd like to do it before the election, because you can imagine a situation where Trump maybe does not get reelected, and then the calls for Congress to wait become even louder. But as a general matter, it is a practice of the Supreme Court that if Amy Coney Barrett was not seated and did not participate in the oral arguments, she would generally recuse herself from deliberation on the case. So if she's not sitting by November 10th at the Supreme Court to hear the oral arguments, generally she would not be participating in the decision, which then means potentially again it's 4-4 or maybe even 5-3 on the issue of severability. So very interesting politics at play here around Judge Barrett's potential appointment to the Supreme Court. All right, moving on now to the next slide here. The presidential election, for folks, in case you don't know, we're in the middle of an election. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, you can't possibly not be aware of what's going on here. These are two slides we pulled from a website called 538. It's Nate Silver from the New York Times. He has his own website where they effectively have tried, I think, to sort of predict the election based on polling data. And for folks who like statistics, they also just do politics and sports. So it's a really interesting website. It's 538.com. But as you'll see here, based on polling as of yesterday around noontime, out of 40,000 simulated elections, Biden wins 82% of them. And you'll see on the right-hand side here, you'll see blue state, red state. Obviously, the popular vote is one thing, but talk to Hillary Clinton, winning the popular vote isn't necessarily can result, I guess, in a Pyrrhic victory. You need those 270 electoral votes. Ryan, I mean, your take on the state of the presidential race, leaving aside sort of the Senate, the House contests. Where do you think we stand with the presidential race, and what do you think the next 4 weeks may hold in terms of how things trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think using historical data and what we typically look at in a normal election, it would be pretty clear that Vice President Biden is on a good path. I think the caveat being that as we saw in 2016, for whatever reason, sometimes the polling when it comes to Trump and his supporters isn't always accurate. So I think I think it's useful that we did use this 538 graphic, because Nate Silver took a lot of heat for predicting that Hillary Clinton would win in a landslide, and really kind of looking back, and I think they have refined the statistical tools they use to look at polling data. So based on that and what we'd see in a normal election, with two sort of more politically candidates who spent their careers in politics, this would all tend favor favor Biden pretty heavily. There is that caveat that things could be, masked in some of the polling data, or that there's something, some kind of advantage on a more discrete level, which is something we saw in 2016, where the Trump campaign did a very good job of identifying down to the precinct level what the most valuable precincts were and where to get the vote out in those precincts. So that effort, I think, I know has continued this year. I know that the Biden campaign is aware of that, was aware of that advantage, and has done a lot of work to overcome that advantage. But when we think about the states that carried Trump in 2016, in the Midwest, those are the places where there's going to be a lot of interesting sort of on the ground political strategy playing out that could have a material impact to, notwithstanding the polling and the popular vote, really get have an impact in the electoral vote.
Thank you, Ryan. So obviously for folks who are following the news, there is a vice presidential debate tonight between Vice President Pence and candidate, or Senator, excuse me, Kamala Harris. It will be interesting to see how that plays out. Allegedly, they have agreed to a plexiglass screen between them as a result of the current hotspot of COVID in the White House. So it will be interesting to see what that literally looks like and how this debate goes out tonight. Turning to the next slide, when we think about issues around tax issues, corporate tax issues, income tax issues, taxation of carried interest, when we think about healthcare policy, when we think about stimulus, when we think about lots of important things, it's going to turn not only on who wins the White House, but who controls the House and who controls the Senate. And so we want to talk a little bit about the congressional races here. Again, pulled from Nate Silver's website here. You'll see the first slide shows you going back to August 1st, sort of which party is expected to control the Senate, out of 100 times as of yesterday, based on the polling data. And what he does is he weights certain polls as, quote, more reliable based on their past performance than others. I think largely an attempt, as Ryan said, to address some of the issues that arose out of the 2016 election. But you'll see there 66 out of 100 times, or approximately 2/3 of their simulated elections, result in the Democrats taking control of Congress. But Ryan, as you mentioned, there has been some recent developments in some key senatorial races that may move those two lines closer together as we head into the election, specifically North Carolina. A little insight on what's going there, obviously PG style.
In North Carolina, Senator Tillis, who's the Republican incumbent, had been facing some pretty significant, had not been polling very well, and had been viewed as, that was generally viewed as a lean Democrat race. Over the weekend and late last week, there were a series of text messages by his Democratic opponent that were uncovered, demonstrating that he was having an affair with someone presumably this past summer, and that has, I think, changed the dynamic there. I would definitely, put that in the October surprise kind of category, where it significantly alters the political dynamics, especially in a state that still does, have a significant sort of more traditional conservative population. You could expect that to have an impact both on, actual votes and voter turnout which in a Senate race that was, was going to be fairly close, could have a material impact. So I think when we talk about when we look at the graph on the left, where there's those divergences don't show that they show a binary change, right? Whether the Senate is Republican or Democrat, not the margin by which the Senate is Democrat or vice versa. And that's important because we're really talking about in that 66 to 34, that's one seat difference. So if there is one race that changes materially in the last few days, then those numbers could change pretty significantly. And if there's the Senate either is a 51-49 split or even a 50-50 split, where you do have some very conservative Democratic senators, that materially alters the prospects of a lot of the things that we'll talk about in terms of health policy, tax policy, and the like. So while I don't think that the Senate or that the House rather is up for debate at all, there are some very close races on the Senate side that could have a significant, could significantly alter what things look like on November 4th. I'll also say that, Maine, which has been, certainly with Susan Collins, has trended heavily or consistently rather in favor of her Democratic opponent, is an interesting state because, she does have a very long history there, and it would be, I think it's hard to discount her, her ability to survive difficult races, which she has faced in the past. So there's definitely an interesting, from a political perspective, a really interesting campaign season with a lot of moving pieces and a lot of very tight races that are playing out right now.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. So now with all of that as background, we're going to turn to the candidates, basically their platform, and obviously their ability to get their platform through on health and tax is going to turn in large part on whether their party controls the House and the Senate. As Ryan mentioned, it's really sort of up in the air in many respects. When you look at Trump, carried interest, this is really sort of partnership, it's sort of equity and partnerships, and the extent to which this sort of compensation tool, which is very common with private equity, how that is taxed. The Trump administration has not sort of suggested really any change to taxing it as long-term capital gains, which has a very reduced rate relative to sort of ordinary income tax rates. The Biden campaign, their position is that it should be taxed as ordinary income because it is, for private equity folks, effectively compensation for services rendered. And this has been a long-term position of the House Democrats and many of the Senate Democrats. So obviously a very significant difference in position there. On corporate taxes, obviously Trump put through a very significant corporate tax rate decrease during his first term. There's no specific change to the corporate tax rate as proposed by Trump. I think he's thought that change has really driven much of the economy for the last 4 years prior to the change in the economy related to COVID. Biden would effectively return the corporate tax rate from the current 21% rate back up to a 28% rate. In terms of individual income taxes, Trump has not suggested he's going to reduce individual income tax rates. If you look at the budget blueprints, they assume basically that they're going to carry through 2025 the current top rate of 37%. Biden administration would, assuming Biden could get us through the House and the Senate, would have a top rate of 39.6% for those earning more than $400,000 of taxable income in a given year. One thing that's not on this slide, but it is important, is that the Biden administration also would make a material change to payroll taxes. As many of you know, payroll taxes, at least the OASDI piece of the payroll tax is capped at a maximum amount of wages that get taken into consideration for this purpose. The Biden administration would effectively eliminate that cap. So all wages, all earned wages would become subject to payroll taxes, which would, in theory, help reinforce the Social Security Trust Fund, but also would result in a lot of additional sort of tax obligation to many Americans, certainly higher earning Americans. Moving on now to the next slide. This is just related to their health proposals. I'm not going to go into a great deal of information on Trump. He's not supportive of Medicare for all. He's generally not supportive of a public option, which Biden does support on the ACA. We spent a fair amount of time talking about it. Biden, as we think about his approach to healthcare, whereas Sanders and some other folks may have been much more in favor of a single risk pool Medicare for all concept. Biden was the vice president during the enactment of the ACA. He has indicated he is supportive of the ACA and would like to expand the ACA. He is not looking for, a single payer Medicare for all solution. Prescription drug prices continue to be a very significant driver of health plan costs. And as you'll see, both Trump and Biden have proposals here. Trump has been actively seeking to try to address prescription drug prices through the tools he has available to him, which is largely the ability of CMS to impose rules in connection with Medicare providers. So specifically talking about Part D here largely. But obviously, what they're able to do after the election during the lame duck session for Trump and for Biden beginning in 2021, if elected, will turn a lot on what happens with those congressional races. So with that, hopefully you got a lot of information and a little bit of inside the Beltway conversation. And I'll turn it now back to Jason Flynn.
Thank you, Seth, both Seth and Ryan. Really fascinating information regarding the regulatory landscape, and we appreciate your insight as always. That wraps up our webinar this morning here. We appreciate everybody attending today to listen to Ryan as well as Seth. We also thank Andy for his contributions as well. So for everybody moving forward, please stay posted to the emails that will come forth regarding future webinars. Also, this slide deck is currently posted to the Prestige PEO website, and the recording will be on the website shortly thereafter. Please look out for our communications as we try to bring as much pertinent information to you as possible. And as a reminder, always feel free to reach out to your designated support staff here at Prestige for any questions you might have. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of your morning here with us at Prestige, and we'll speak to you soon.